Hey guys, tonight we will dive into one of the saddest and most haunting chapters in European royal history. This is the story of Mariana of Austria, a girl born on Christmas Eve in the year 1634 inside the Hofburg Palace, carrying from the very first breath the burden of 3 centuries of inbred marriages. From childhood, her fate had already been carved in stone. She would become the wife of her own uncle, King Philip IV of Spain, a union forged not out of affection, but out of the Habsburg dynasty's relentless obsession with preserving what they called their pure blood. Outing. That marriage, closed in on itself like a perfect circle, created consequences that could no longer be hidden. The children born from it were frail, malformed, and short-lived, and ultimately came Charles II, the son whose twisted body, heavy, protruding jaw, and fragile mind became the biological invoice that history presented to the dynasty. He was the final, tragic proof of what happens when power is protected at the cost of nature itself, the culmination of a genetic equation that the Habsburgs had miscalculated from the very beginning. And through it all, Mariana was not only the product of this destiny, she was its prisoner, and the slow witness to her own dynasty's collapse. Hers is a somber, sleepy story, where personal resilience struggles quietly against an inevitable downfall. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I would love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Share your city and your local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the scene. Vienna, Christmas Eve. In the year 1634, the Hofburg Palace lies wrapped in a heavy, breathless silence, broken only by the slow, solemn tolling of the midnight bells and the hurried footsteps of servants echoing through frozen corridors. Outside, snow gathers against the iron gates, where the carved eagles of the Habsburg dynasty perch eternally, their wings appearing stiff and brittle under the touch of winter frost. The world seems to hold its breath, as if the night itself understands that something fragile, something fated, is unfolding behind the palace walls. Inside, the air is thick, almost syrupy, with the mingled scents of incense, melted candle wax, and the faint metallic tang of iron drifting from the royal bedchamber. It is the quiet, unmistakable smell of blood, the silent footprint that childbirth leaves behind. A young woman has just delivered a child, and the dark crimson stains spreading across the silk sheets are the price paid to keep one of Europe's most perilous dynasties alive. In the hands of the midwife rests a newborn girl, her tiny face flushed a warm, trembling red from the struggle of entering this world. She is small, wrinkled, fragile, like any other infant, but the room seems to lean toward her, sensing the weight of the history she has been born into. To the servants and courtiers gathered outside the chamber, she is simply another princess, one more name to be inked into the long scroll of Habsburg births. Dynasties expect children the way winter expects snow. Inevitably, repeatedly, almost mechanically, yet the centuries ahead will not remember her as ordinary. They will call her Mariana of Austria, the most inbred queen in the long, tangled saga of European royalty. For the blood inside her veins is not an ordinary river, but a labyrinth, twisted and bent by generations upon generations of uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, and nephew to aunt marriages. What should have branched outward like a mighty tree has instead looped back upon itself, forming a closed circle where roots and branches intertwine until the very structure begins to buckle. Her father, Ferdinand III, destined to become Holy Roman Emperor, was not merely related to her mother. Mariana of Spain was both his cousin and his niece, the product of overlapping lines on a family tree that long ago ceased to grow upward and instead folded inward like a collapsing star. The infant who now cries softly in the midwife's arms is the newest result of a multi-century experiment, the belief that political power can be purified and preserved through the tightening of bloodlines. Land, alliances, crowns, and empires had been tied together by tying the genetic knot ever tighter. Every Habsburg marriage was a strategic equation, and this newborn child is the sum of each calculation, gone before a sum whispered through bone and marrow before she ever draws her first full breath. As priests murmur prayers of thanksgiving in the half-lit room, none of them speak aloud the quiet truth already evident. Even in these earliest moments, the infant's tiny features carry the unmistakable imprint of her lineage. Her jaw is slightly heavier than that of an ordinary newborn, her lips pushing forward in a faint, familiar protrusion, the earliest shadow of the infamous Habsburg jaw. Her eyelids droop softly, her chin recedes just a touch more than nature usually intends. To the 17th century eye, these signs are shrugged away, seen as mere quirks of noble blood. But to us, looking back through the long corridor of history, they are early echoes of a body bearing the cumulative load of centuries. This is not simply a birth. It is another turn of the wheel in a dangerous wager, a wager placed repeatedly upon human flesh. A dynasty that refused to mix its blood has called forth yet another child to bear its weight. And as the candles flicker in the cold air, as the newborn's thin wail rises toward the vaulted ceiling, the night itself seems to understand that what has arrived is not just a daughter, not just a princess, but the next vessel of a lineage slowly tightening around itself, a quiet beginning to a life shaped entirely by choices made long before she was born. To understand Mariana's destiny, one must first understand the arithmetic of incest that had, over the course of 3 centuries, hardened into deliberate policy within the House of Austria, the Habsburgs. For 300 years, they pursued a single, unwavering, and deeply ruthless obsession: to keep their empire intact by ensuring that no foreign blood ever diluted the lineage. While other dynasties looked outward, seeking alliances across borders, trading daughters for treaties and sons for influence, the Habsburgs turned inward. They folded their own family tree upon itself again and again. They married nieces. They married first cousins. They married the children of their siblings. They even married the children who called them uncle. These were not occasional accidents, not curiosities of royal matchmaking, but repeated and intentional choices. Choices that slowly reshaped their genealogy from a branching tree into a tightening circle, closing like a noose around its own trunk. What should have been a web of connections spreading across Europe became instead a looped, constricted pattern, generation after generation, until the line strained under the weight of its own unnatural design. Philip II of Spain married his own niece, Anna of Austria. Their son, Philip III, followed the pattern and married his cousin, Margaret of Austria. And then, Philip IV, the man who would one day become Mariana's husband, repeated the cycle once more by marrying his own niece, Maria Anna of Austria, the woman who became Mariana's mother. When viewed through the calm lens of time, the pattern is unmistakable. This was not misfortune. It was strategy. But strategies have costs. The price, in this case, was imprinted upon the bodies of the children born from such unions. Children who were weak, children who sickened easily, children whose lives flickered out before they ever found their place in the world. Some carried visible deformities, some carried invisible fragilities. All bore the quiet burden of choices made long before they existed. In the childbirth chamber where Mariana had just been born, no one thought of such things, not yet. The midwife lifted the tiny infant up for all to see, her swaddled form trembling with the force of her first breath. Courtiers bowed their heads, offering murmured thanks for this new princess, seeing in her only the confirmation of divine favor and another brick placed carefully into the towering wall of Habsburg power. She was, to them, a symbol, a triumph, proof that the dynasty continued. But to the modern eye, the truth behind the candlelit scene is far more complex. The features that court painters would one day soften with carefully layered oils, the elongated skull, the slightly drooping eyelids, the softened, slack musculature around the jaw, the subtle but unmistakable forward thrust of the lower lip, were already present. These were not random quirks of appearance. These were early signals, faint but clear, of a body already bearing centuries of accumulated genetic strain. A dynasty cannot escape the mathematics it creates. Even in her cradle, Mariana carried within her the paradox that had come to define the Habsburgs, the apparent victory of maintaining a pure, unbroken line of succession, and, at the same time, the silent, growing warning that such purity was carving fissures deep within the foundation of the dynasty itself. Every marriage meant to preserve strength had, instead, layered weakness upon weakness. Every generation had folded the line tighter, until the pressure threatened to break it. She had no awareness of this, of course. She was only a newborn, her tiny fists curling and uncurling against the blanket, her eyelids fluttering with the soft rhythm of exhausted sleep. Yet her bones, her blood, her very shape, already whispered the truth that history would one day recognize. She was both the continuation of an ancient lineage and the herald of its decline. She embodied the triumph of a strategy and the doom hidden within it. In that cold Vienna night, the snow pressed quietly against the palace walls. Servants moved softly through the hallways. Priests gave thanks. A mother, drained and pale, closed her eyes in exhausted relief. And in her cradle, Mariana lay waiting, unaware that she was the living equation of a dynasty's ambition, and that the numbers were beginning, ever so slowly, to turn against her. When Mariana grew up within the wide, cold chambers of the Hofburg, she was surrounded not only by embroidered tapestries, silver candelabras, and sprawling maps of the empire, but also by silent ghosts, brothers, sisters, cousins who had died before they were old enough to form a single memory. Early death was common across 17th-century Europe, but in the House of Habsburg it unfolded with a cruelty far more relentless. Too many children were born with skulls swollen by fluid, with twisted spines, or with bodies so frail that the first winter was enough to bury them. These deaths were recorded with polite, pious phrases, passed by the will of God, weakness from birth. Yet the truth beneath those words was clear. This was the accumulating invoice for generations of consanguineous unions, a bill paid by the smallest and most vulnerable. Compared with them, Mariana appeared almost healthy. She survived infancy. She was fed, taught, dressed in heavy layers of brocade and velvet. But the keen-eyed observers at court still noticed the pallor of her skin, the shape already settling into her face, the quiet shadow of the Habsburg lineage. The lower jaw pushed forward, the eyelids drooped slightly. The chin receded in a way no painter could fully disguise except through carefully chosen angles and generous, forgiving light. In her own time, these features were praised as noble bearing, the unmistakable stamp of exalted blood. Physicians of later centuries, however, would call them mandibular deformities, and the natural outcome of overlapping genetics. Her childhood was not a season of carefree play, but a cold preparation. In the great halls where vast maps of Europe lay unrolled across oak tables, Mariana's destiny was calculated with the same precision used to plan a military campaign. She was never regarded as a child in the simple, human sense. She was a resource, a future bargaining chip, a vessel meant for alliance. Her womb was the battlefield upon which future treaties would live or die. Around her, courtiers whispered constantly of inheritances, kingdoms, and far-off territories. To them, her face was not the face of a little girl. It was an unsigned signature on a treaty drafted long before she could walk, an agreement that had been waiting for her since the moment she was placed in her cradle. And in that quiet, in those echoing halls, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who looked both familiar and strangely distorted, Mariana grew, carrying within her a destiny she had never chosen, yet one that had already claimed her long before she took her first steps. By the time Mariana reached the age of 15, the machinery of politics had completed its work. She would leave Austria for Spain, not as a bride choosing happiness, but as the final link in a chain that had been tightening for generations. Vienna, in the year 1649. Before the high altar of a great church, a girl stood motionless in a silver brocade gown so heavy that it dragged across the cold stone floor. This was Mariana of Austria, deemed of age to fulfill the purpose for which she had been born. Yet the man she was marrying, Philip IV of Spain, her own uncle, nearly 3 decades older, was not even present. In his place stood a Spanish ambassador, reciting vows on the king's behalf, binding her with words that fell like iron links into place, sealing a marriage decided long before she had understood what marriage meant. The ceremony was solemn, lawful, sacred, and yet, to Mariana, it felt less like a promise and more like a sentence being read aloud. Courtiers whispered about the brilliance of the match. Austria and Spain would once again be joined, the Habsburg circle drawn tighter, the dynasty reinforced. But if one stood in the shadows of that church and looked beyond the grandeur, something different appeared. Another knot pulled in the rope of blood that was slowly, inexorably, constricting itself. After the proxy wedding came the long and unforgiving journey. The carriages, heavy with her dowry, creaked through the passes of the Alps like a funeral procession wearing a disguise. The girl who had only just left childhood sat within, watching mountains flatten into plains, and plains dry into the sunburned landscapes of Castile. Ahead of her lay a world where queens were not wives, but sacred relics, displayed, revered, and suffocated beneath layers of rigid ceremonial expectations. When the wheels finally touched Spanish soil, the last of her Austrian attendants were dismissed. In their place appeared strangers, faces unfamiliar, backs bowed deeply, voices soft and formal, but eyes cool and appraising. Their gazes held no warmth, no recognition of the girl she had been. To them, she was no longer little Mariana. She was the queen, the vessel into which all of Spain's hopes would be poured and, perhaps, shattered. The air around her shifted, becoming heavier with every new protocol she was required to follow. Her title changed overnight, but so did her identity. The child from Vienna disappeared beneath layers of silk, etiquette, and expectation. The markers of home, her language, her familiar servants, the cold Viennese corridors she once wandered, were replaced by the solemn silence of the Spanish court, where every step was measured, every glance monitored, and every breath seemed to echo within the rigid boundaries set long before she arrived. The journey had not only carried her across mountains and borders, it had transported her into a future shaped entirely by others. Each mile that passed under the wheels of the carriage had peeled away another layer of her former self, until at last she arrived not as a girl with memories, fears, and dreams, but as a symbol, a promise, and a sacrifice chosen long before her birth. And as the sun set behind the Castilian horizon, casting long shadows across the land that would now be hers, Mariana stepped into her new life, carrying with her the quiet weight of a destiny that had already begun to tighten around her, unseen but unyielding. The official wedding ceremony in Madrid was staged with a splendor meant to disguise the weariness beneath it. Fountains flowed with wine, roses were draped into arches above the streets, and entire villages emptied their coffers to contribute to the welcome of their new queen. King Philip, 44 years old, wore robes of brilliant gold and crimson. Yet no shimmer of silk could hide the deep lines etched by war, by grief, by the loss of children who had died before their time. Beside him, Mariana appeared like a silver ghost, her gown catching the candlelight like the edge of a blade. She was at once a niece and a wife, a daughter of Austria and the Queen of Spain. Standing near her was Maria Theresa, the king's daughter from his earlier marriage, nearly her age. A stepmother, hardly older than the stepdaughter, a bitter irony no one dared to smile at, for the entire court held its breath in anticipation of one thing only: a son. Madrid extinguished laughter in ways Vienna never had. Here, silence was law. The queen lived as a ceremonial object, every step predetermined, every bow calculated to an exact angle, every prayer overseen by the king's confessors. Mariana adapted quickly. She learned to bow just enough, smile at the precise moment, and hide fear beneath a surface of serene obedience. Her body might be fragile, her jaw heavy, her complexion pale, but her mind sharpened, for in this labyrinth a single misstep would swallow her whole. Yet her true test did not unfold in the throne room, but in the nursery. Spain needed a prince. Europe watched her womb as if it were a battlefield. In the year 1651, her first child, a daughter, Margaret Theresa, was born and survived. She would one day enter yet another consanguineous marriage, this time with Mariana's own brother. To the court, this was triumph. To us, looking back, it is simply another turn of the tightening spiral. In the year 1655, another girl was born, Maria Ambrosia, only to die a few months later. The gentle phrases written into official records, born weak, taken by God, did little to mask the truth. These small bodies had been marked from the moment they were conceived. In the year 1657, a son arrived, Philip Prospero. For 4 brief years he embodied hope for the kingdom. Court painters captured him glowing with vitality, as if paint could override biology. But in the year 1661, he died, and hope was buried with him. Another son, Ferdinand Thomas, lived less than 1 year. Each tiny coffin carried through the streets of Madrid was another digit in the blood-soaked arithmetic of history. These were no longer acts of God, but the mounting debt of a genetic ledger stretched to its limit. The dynasty was paying for its choices, one small grave at a time. Then, in the year 1661, another child was born, Charles. He survived, and survival alone was called a miracle. But even in infancy, his body told a harsher story. His limbs were weak, his development delayed, his jaw protruding sharply beyond what nature intended. Nurses whispered prayers over him, priests held relics near him, and yet his frailty was unmistakable. The court called him blessed. History calls him the exclamation mark at the end of the Spanish Habsburgs, a final, catastrophic sign that the lineage was collapsing under the weight of its own insistence on purity. His birth was not a remedy for the dynasty's wounds, but the visible culmination of them. And as the candles flickered in the palace corridors, As Madrid tried to celebrate the arrival of an heir, the cold truth lingered quietly beneath the festivities. The line had not been strengthened, but broken. Charles had come into the world with the dynasty's entire burden written into his bones. In the year 1665, the sky over Madrid hung heavy like lead, casting upon the Alcazar Palace the ashen hue of an empire already beginning to decay. Inside the royal death chamber, where candles flickered with the faint, unsteady rhythm of a dying breath, King Philip IV exhaled for the final time. Beside him, dressed in black mourning silk, stood Mariana, only 31 years old, suddenly a widow, suddenly a regent, and now the sole guardian of a fragile 4-year-old child who could barely stand without support. Charles, the boy whom all of Europe regarded as the living embodiment of a genetic tragedy, had become the king of an empire stretching from Madrid to Manila. But beneath the solemn ceremony lay a stark and merciless truth. The fate of this vast dominion would not be determined by armies or fleets, but by the survival of a child who could not speak clearly, could not chew, and could not grow as other children did. While Charles trembled in his nursery beneath whispered prayers and holy relics, Mariana, once seen as no more than a decorative pawn, stepped into the chamber of the Council of State. She no longer moved like a girl, trapped within ritual. She walked like a woman carrying an empire on her shoulders. The Spanish grandees, grey-bearded nobles, who embodied the old pride of Castile, bowed before her. Yet in their bow there were thorns. They saw her as an outsider, the Austrian woman, a foreigner, and, worst of all in their eyes, a woman. 3 burdens, each heavy enough on its own, now combined in the person who would lead them. But law and bloodline stood behind her, and that shield was unbreakable. Mariana's first decision stunned the court. She appointed her Austrian confessor, Juan Everardo Nithard, as chief minister, a foreigner, a priest. Elevated above the nobility of Spain, the spark of resentment ignited at once, catching fire in the dry underbrush of national pride. Yet Mariana did not flinch. She understood that her battle would not be fought only against France or Portugal or the emptying treasury. She knew she faced a deeper struggle, against the entrenched expectations of a nobility that believed women belonged on thrones only as ornaments, never as rulers. Meanwhile, from the nursery, the fate of the empire was being measured in the ragged breaths of Charles. No one dared to say it aloud, but all knew it in their bones. Spain did not simply need a king, it needed a body capable of surviving. And that was something no council decree could guarantee. His jaw protruded, his tongue struggled to form words, his limbs weakened at the weight of standing. Every sign whispered the same truth. The empire's future had been placed upon a frame too delicate to bear it. Still, Mariana held herself upright. Her figure, veiled in mourning, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She learned to navigate the thorn-laced conversations of the council, to shield her son with decisions that strained the limits of her authority, and to present the image of unshakable calm before a court desperate to find cracks in her composure. For she knew with absolute clarity, if she faltered, even once, the empire would not simply tremble, it would collapse. Every day, the weight pressed harder. Every hour, the whispers in the palace grew sharper. But she did not bend. She had entered widowhood and regency in the same breath. And in that moment, she became something the court had never expected, the spine of a crumbling empire. And though the candles burned low in the corridors of the Alcazar, though the air of Madrid carried the scent of decline, Mariana remained standing because she understood the cruelest truth of all. Spain no longer lived on its armies, its colonies, or its gold. It lived on her, and on a child who might not live long enough to save it. If Mariana faced external enemies, such as France under Louis XIV, the most dangerous enemy of all lived within her own royal household, Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of Philip IV. Don Juan was handsome, courageous, a successful military commander, and most importantly, he belonged to Spain in a way Mariana never could. In the eyes of the Spanish nobility and the people of Madrid, Don Juan was everything the regent queen was not: a Spanish man, a king's son, someone born to lead. Rumors spread quickly, in taverns, in public squares, in the echoing corridors of the royal palace. Voices murmured the same refrain. Spain suffers because an Austrian woman rules it. Tension rose like floodwater. The palace transformed into a vast chessboard. Each appointment Mariana made created a new enemy. Each whisper about young Charles's fragility fanned the flames of resentment. Don Juan gathered to himself the displaced, the devout who despised Nithard, the soldiers who saw Mariana as an intruder. Gradually, he became the banner of a new Spanish nationalism, a belief that only a native-born Spaniard had the right to determine the empire's destiny. And, as in all classical tragedies, political conflict intertwined with personal grief. Don Juan was not only a rival, he was the son of the husband who had left Mariana alone in a country that never fully accepted her. He was the embodiment of a comparison she could never win, masculine strength set against the delicate, foreign-born figure of an Austrian woman. Pressure from the streets of Madrid grew dangerous. Crowds chanted, "Down with the Austrians! Down with Nithard!" Their cries seeped through the palace windows like icy draughts, reaching Mariana's ears as warnings rather than mere noise. She looked at her frail child, at an empire slipping slowly beyond her grasp, and understood that this struggle could not be won through law or lineage alone. It would be won through endurance. A kind of endurance only someone like Mariana, a woman who had lived her entire life inside a gilded cage built by fate, could possess. In the years that followed, Madrid felt like a city under siege, not by foreign armies, but by whispers, by midnight conspiracies, by rebellions that flickered like candles behind closed doors. Pressure tightened around Mariana from every direction, pressing against her ribs like an invisible weight. The bishops accused Nithard of poisoning the soul of Spain. The grandees denounced him as a manipulator, a shadow puppeteer. The common people spat his name into the streets, calling him the symbol of corruption, simply because he was the Austrian. The hatred was sharp enough to draw blood, and soon even Mariana's own life trembled beneath its blade. Cornered, she was forced to sacrifice Nithard. On a cold night, his carriage rolled out of Madrid, beneath a chorus of jeers and insults hurled by the crowd. The wheels echoed like the tolling of a funeral bell. It was a bitter defeat, a humiliation carved into memory. But it was the only decision that could keep the country from exploding into chaos. Mariana appointed a Spaniard, Valenzuela, to replace him, hoping to calm the storm. Instead, it lit another fuse. The political landscape shifted like sand. Every ally could become an enemy by sunrise. Every promise could rot into betrayal before nightfall. Power moved in circles around her, tightening, loosening, and tightening again. Meanwhile, Charles, the thin, trembling boy with the protruding jaw and the halting speech, grew older, and with every inch of his slow development, the whispers about him grew louder. People watched him stumble through the palace corridors and murmured, "This is the price of ancestral sin." The church prayed. Physicians bled him, cupped him, burned incense, and applied charms. Nothing changed. Nothing healed. An entire empire was beginning to recognize the truth no one dared to utter aloud. The foundation of their world, the Habsburg bloodline, was rotting from within. And always, looming over everything, was the shadow of Don Juan. He gathered soldiers. He gathered nobles. He gathered those who believed Spain needed saving from the Austrian queen and her sickly child. He became a symbol, a rallying point, the embodiment of resistance. And at last, he marched on Madrid like a hero, returning to claim what destiny had promised him. Mariana understood the danger. She understood that resisting now would light the fuse of civil war. So she made a choice that was not surrender but survival. She withdrew calmly, deliberately, to Toledo. A retreat, yes, but only the kind that allows one to live long enough to fight again. Time, she knew, was an ally with a cruel sense of timing. And 2 years later, Don Juan died suddenly. No warning, no explanation, no triumphant end. Whispers rustled through Spain like wind through dry grass. Fate had spoken. But Mariana, standing in her quiet chambers, understood something deeper, something colder. In this court, in this dynasty, under the weight of this cursed bloodline, no one who fought against the destiny of the Habsburgs ever lived long. After the death of Don Juan, Mariana returned to Madrid like a steadfast shadow, not as a triumphant victor, but as the last surviving piece on a board where every other player had already fallen. The court had believed she lost everything. Yet Mariana possessed something her rival never learned to wield: time. She knew how to wait, how to retreat when necessary, how to remain silent when silence itself became a source of power. The royal palace once again turned into an invisible battlefield. Fragile diplomatic agreements that trembled like cracked glass, an exhausted treasury, rebellious territories straining against the crown, war with France, the rising force of the Bourbon dynasty, and overshadowing all of it a king who could not grow the way a king must. Charles entered adolescence with the body of a child carved by misfortune. His jaw was so heavy that eating became a torment. His speech was tangled, uncertain, his spine curved. His immune system was so fragile that even a mild fever could become deadly. Each step he took was a reminder of the dynasty's long descent. All of Europe examined him and understood with chilling clarity. This dynasty had no future. Yet Mariana continued to rule alone beneath the storm. She signed treaties, negotiated loans, kept the army standing, and prevented the empire from collapsing sooner. She could not save Charles, but she could hold back the darkness for one more year, then another, then another. She bought the empire time, not triumph, not glory, but breath. Every day she entered the council chamber, her black silk trailing over the cold stone floor, and the Spanish grandees were forced to bow. They, who had once sought to cast her into oblivion, now depended on her clarity, her endurance, her unyielding intelligence. They might not have respected her, but they needed her. Some victories leave no celebration behind them, delaying war for a season, keeping a border quiet through a single winter, preventing the treasury from collapsing one more time. Mariana carried these victories alone, no applause, no praise, not even acknowledgement. But within the silent rooms of the Alcazar, she understood exactly what she was doing. She was buying time. Time for a sick child who clung to life. Time for an aging empire that still had a heartbeat. Time for Spain to breathe a little longer, however faint that breath might be. This was the kind of triumph history rarely recognizes: the triumph of women. Underestimated, women dismissed, women taught to endure. It was not glorious, it was not radiant, but it shifted the fate of the world all the same. By the late 1670s, the greatest question haunting Europe was simple and merciless. Can Charles produce an heir? For if he could not, the vast Spanish Empire from South America to southern Europe would be carved apart, fought over, swallowed whole by the powers circling like vultures. In the year 1679, when Charles was 17 years old but possessed the frail body of a chronically ill child, Mariana arranged his first marriage. The bride was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a beautiful French princess, healthy, radiant, a burst of light in a court smothered by gloom. But the wedding did not end in hope. It ended in murmurs. She was too young, too lovely, too full of life, everything Charles was not. The king struggled to walk, struggled to speak, struggled even to breathe when illness pressed too hard upon him. And yet all of Spain clung to Marie-Louise, as though she were the final plank of a sinking ship. Year after year, however, her womb remained empty. Physicians blamed the cold air of Madrid, her melancholy, her diet, even her supposed refusal to adapt to Spanish customs. But the truth, unspoken yet universally understood, lay with Charles. His body could not create an heir. His lineage was a thread worn thin by centuries. After 10 years of a hope that never bloomed, Marie-Louise died suddenly. Rumors erupted like wildfire. Some whispered that she had been poisoned by the Austrian faction. Others insisted it was illness. But regardless of the cause, one truth remained. The dynasty still had no successor. Mariana, now 45 years old, her resilience, honed by decades of storm, chose another bride. Maria Anna of Neuburg, renowned for coming from a family blessed with many children, was selected as though fertility itself were a cure for a dying bloodline. But when she arrived in Madrid, the palace no longer held even the fragile illusion of hope. Her new husband, King Charles, was nearly spent. His jaw had grown so pronounced he struggled to close his mouth. His legs trembled beneath him. Seizures racked his body. Court physicians began documenting what they called signs of comprehensive physical decline. And still no child, no miracle, no future. Europe stopped pretending. France, Austria, England, all drew maps behind closed doors, sketching and resketching a world in which Spain was no longer a power, but a carcass to be divided. The empire was being partitioned on paper before the king himself had died. And Mariana, watching her husband, her son, her empire, understood the truth more clearly than anyone. The enemy she had fought all her life was not France, not the nobles, not Don Juan, not foreign powers. It was the bloodline that had created her, the same bloodline that was now unraveling everything it touched. Entering the decade of 1690, what had once been whispered in stone corridors had now become a truth spoken openly, even bluntly. Charles could not produce an heir. It was not for lack of prayer, nor lack of physicians, nor lack of wives. It was because his body, the final distillation of 3 centuries of consanguineous marriage, had rejected the most basic function of life itself. In the rare council sessions where he appeared, Charles looked less like a king and more like a breathing apparition. His eyes bulged from deep sockets. His lower jaw hung so heavily that his lips could not close. His steps wavered, as though he were bound by invisible cords. Even the act of eating something so small, so ordinary, had to be documented in medical ledgers, because every swallow was a struggle. But more terrible than his physical suffering was the way Europe looked at him. Ambassadors wrote letters home not about diplomacy but about Charles's appearance, treating his body as living proof of a dynasty's decay. A French ambassador wrote, "The king is no different from a walking corpse." An English observer wrote, "If Spain expects from him a prince, they will wait until the end of days." Eyewears, and worse still, European powers had already begun drawing maps dividing Spain before the king had even died. Inside the palace, murmured prayers drifted through the halls. Priests performed exorcisms, convinced that Charles had been bewitched. Physicians dissected animals, studied their organs, and predicted futures through colors and shapes, as if magic could repair broken genes. Mariana understood the truth more clearly than anyone. She looked at her son, his twisted body, his clouded mind, his breath fragile as thin paper, and knew that the fate of the Habsburg dynasty had been written long before he was born. The bloodline that had once been a source of pride had become a burden, and the boy before her was the painful conclusion to the equation their ancestors had crafted. Preserve pureza, the purity of blood, at any cost. And now the cost was the collapse of an entire empire. Mariana, who had spent her life bending her back to resist the weight of destiny, began to feel her own shoulders splinter beneath the burden of what could not be saved. When the hope of an heir finally vanished, Spain was no longer an empire but a wounded creature bleeding slowly across the map, drawing predators from every direction. Louis XIV of France, Leopold I of Austria, and the monarchs of England all stepped quietly into secret negotiations. They were not waiting for the king to die. They were merely waiting for him to fall at the right moment. Behind closed doors, they drafted treaties of division, carving up Spain the way one might divide an inheritance. Naples to one house, Flanders to another, the American colonies sliced apart like distant jewels, and the Spanish throne placed on the bargaining table as if it were nothing more than an object to be traded. Meanwhile, Charles began to believe he was bewitched. Any stomach pain, seizure, or fever was attributed to sorcery. He was so fragile that the Cortes of Castile feared the truth itself might shatter him. His mind wavered, clinging to rituals, relics, and whispered prayers, as if piety could mend what centuries of inbreeding had broken. Mariana, now past 60, still held the reins behind the scenes. She knew she could not restore Spain's former power, but she could try desperately, stubbornly to preserve its integrity, the way a mother with broken shoulders still tries to hold a dying child in her arms. She wrote letters to Leopold, her brother in Vienna, urging Austria to prepare to claim the Spanish succession so that France would not swallow the peninsula whole. Yet there was bitter irony in this plan. The very bloodline Mariana trusted to save Spain was the same bloodline that had led it into its terminal decline. The entire court lived beneath the sensation of time draining away. Every corridor felt narrower. Every council meeting felt shorter. Every whisper felt heavier. Charles's room had become the center of Europe not because of the power he held, but because of the power he was losing. The king's weakness drew more attention than any army or treaty. Monarchs waited for reports on his health with the same intensity as generals awaiting news from a battlefield. For every breath Charles took, maps shifted. For every breath he struggled to take, alliances changed. And Mariana, exhausted but unbroken, held on. She clung to each fragile breath her son drew, not because she believed it would save the empire, but because buying one more day, one more season felt like the only weapon left to her. If disaster could be delayed by one winter, then she would take that winter. If fate could be postponed by a single heartbeat, she would guard that heartbeat, even if the empire she tried to protect was already slipping through her fingers like sand. By the late 1690s, Charles, now more than 30 years old, but trapped in the body of an elderly man, could no longer stand without help. His steps trembled, his heart weakened, and his mind drifted in and out of a fog that never fully cleared. Court physicians recorded eyes tinted yellow, swollen legs, a belly distended with fluid, each symptom a clear sign of total organ failure. Never in European history had the medical condition of a monarch been observed so closely by foreign powers. France hoped Charles would die quickly so a Bourbon claimant could ascend the throne. Austria hoped he would live a little longer to finalize succession plans. England and the Dutch Republic watched every report, every rumor, every pulse of news, attempting to balance a continent on the edge. Charles was no longer a man. He was the axis around which Europe turned. But within the Alcazar, Charles was simply the only surviving son of Mariana, a mother who had lost too much already. She saw in him the shadows of all the children who had died, all the marriages that had crumbled, all the tiny coffins carried through cold courtyards. She understood what Europe refused to admit aloud. Charles was the final leaf of a winter that had lasted 3 centuries. He could not produce an heir. He could not govern. He could barely live. And yet each morning, attendants dressed him, lifted him upright, combed his hair, and opened the palace windows so he could perform the only duty left to a dying king, to exist. And then, one night, his breath grew heavy, then stopped. The year was 1699. Charles II was dead, no heir, no hope. Nothing left to anchor a dynasty that had ruled Europe for 300 years. The silence that fell over Madrid that night was not the mourning of a king. It was the long, exhausted sigh of a bloodline that had finally reached its end. Mariana did not live to see the moment her son died. In the year 1696, 3 years before Charles took his final breath, she closed her eyes for the last time, in a quiet chamber of the Alcazar. The body that had once endured so fiercely had finally worn down after 30 years of resisting fate, resisting enemies, resisting whispers, resisting the one truth she could never change. The Habsburg bloodline was destroying itself from within. She died at 62 years old. Not in triumph, not beneath the glow of royal celebration, but in the weary silence of someone who had carried an empire for far too long, too heavily, too alone. Her funeral stretched through the streets of Madrid, the same streets that had once despised the Austrian woman. But on that day, they called her by another name, Madre de España, Mother of Spain, because no one could deny it. Without her, the empire would likely have collapsed many years earlier. She was buried at El Escorial, resting place of Spain's kings. Beneath the cold stone, in the stillness of the royal mausoleum, Mariana became something almost mythic, at once a victim of her lineage and the final guardian of a fading imperial dream. No one said it aloud, but all understood. She died with a fragile hope still flickering inside her that Charles would one day have a child, that the dynasty would survive her, that her suffering would not dissolve into nothing. But history chose another path, and the harsh truth of that path she never had to witness. After the death of Charles, and before him the death of Mariana, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty collapsed. The throne passed into the hands of the Bourbon family after the War of Spanish Succession, and Europe was torn apart in a conflict sparked entirely by the absence of a single heir, by the frail body of one man who could not produce a child. But when history turns back to look at Mariana, it does not see only the most inbred queen in Europe. It sees something far more human, far more complex, and far more enduring. It sees a 15-year-old girl forced into a wedding without a groom. It sees a mother who buried children until her strength nearly broke. It sees a 31-year-old widow facing an entire continent with nothing but her will. It sees a regent who kept an empire breathing when the empire could no longer breathe for itself. It sees a woman who remained steadfast in a world that never fully accepted her presence. She became a living testament to the truth the Habsburgs never understood. Power does not lie in the purity of blood, but in the endurance of the human spirit. Mariana failed to save her dynasty, but she succeeded in something quieter, deeper, and perhaps more lasting. She reminded the world that even inside one of history's most tragic genealogies, the will of a single woman could resist destiny longer than anyone imagined. And if she could not break the genetic curse that had been tightening around the dynasty for 3 centuries, she did manage to slow it, to delay it just long enough that Spain would not collapse immediately. Just long enough that the world would be forced to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. An empire may fall because of corrupted blood, but it can also survive a little longer because of a good heart. In the dim corridors of memory, Mariana remains. A silhouette draped in black silk, a steady gaze beneath a heavy veil, a quiet strength in a world defined by noise and violence. She is both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that the decisions of rulers echo through the brittle bones of their descendants, and that the cost of pride can be measured not in battles, but in coffins, no longer than a cradle. For centuries, The Habsburgs believed they could outwit nature, outmaneuver fate, and hold their power together by tightening the family circle until it became a noose. They believed blood could be controlled, shaped, purified like metal in a forge. But Mariana's life and Charles's death revealed the truth they refused to face. Nature always writes the final chapter. And yet, even as collapse pressed in from every direction, Mariana held the line. She stood against France, against Austria, against England, against the very nobles who swore loyalty with their lips while plotting with their hands. She stood against time itself, slowing the unraveling of a world built on brittle foundations. She stood because she had nothing else. She stood because no one else could. She stood because endurance was the only weapon left to her. And in the end, that endurance outlived the dynasty she had been born to protect. When Charles died in the year 1699, the silence that fell over Madrid was not the mourning of a monarch. It was the exhale of a bloodline that had finally reached its end. It was the heavy, inevitable sound of history closing a door. But Mariana's story does not end there. In the centuries that followed, scholars and storytellers continued to return to her, not out of morbid fascination with her lineage, but out of respect for the strength she carried. In a palace full of ghosts, she remained the one figure who refused to disappear. She persisted in the records, in the letters, in the portraits, where her eyes seemed to hold both sorrow and defiance. And she persisted in the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes survival, not victory, is the greatest act of power. A fragile figure standing against an empire's twilight. A woman who delayed the fall of a dynasty, built to crush her. A mother who fought a losing battle with dignity greater than any king she ever served. Mariana remains in history like a small flame in a long night, fragile, flickering, but impossibly enduring. A reminder that even when the blood of an empire fails, the courage of one person can hold back the darkness, if only for a moment longer. As we drift toward the end of this long, winding journey, let the images slowly soften in your mind. The stone corridors of the Alcazar grow dimmer, the echoing footsteps fade, and the weight of crowns and genealogies begins to dissolve into something quieter, gentler, almost like mist settling over a still landscape. Mariana, Charles, the Habsburgs, all of them belong to a world built on ceremony and silence, a world where power was measured in bloodlines and alliances, but where the human heart still beat with fear, hope, and the need to endure. If you listen closely, beneath the noise of battles and treaties, you can almost hear that heartbeat now, steady, faint, yet persistent, like a memory that refuses to vanish. Allow yourself to breathe slower as you picture Mariana in her final years, no longer the frightened bride, no longer the embattled regent, but a woman who carried the weight of a collapsing empire with a strange, steadfast grace. Her story reminds us that even within the most rigid structures, even beneath the heaviest expectations, there is still room for courage. Quiet courage, the kind that does not roar, but endures, the kind that outlasts the very things meant to destroy it. And as the last embers of the Habsburg line flicker out, the lesson they leave behind becomes clearer. Power built on fear and control cannot survive forever. But resilience, compassion, and the unwillingness to surrender can stretch time itself. For a moment, sometimes for years, a single person's strength can hold the world together. Tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, let that truth settle gently with you. Let it remind you that even in your own life, in the middle of storms you never asked for, your quiet endurance matters. Your presence matters. The battles you fight silently, the burdens you carry without recognition, they shape the world around you in ways you may never fully see. The story of Mariana is not only a cautionary tale about bloodlines and destiny. It is a reminder that strength does not always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like continuing, holding on, taking one more breath. And now, as the final scenes fade and only a soft hush remains, allow your mind to grow heavy, your thoughts to drift, and your body to unwind into calmness. You've journeyed through centuries tonight across palaces, across continents, across the fragile boundary between survival and collapse, and now it is time to rest. So, sleep well, my friend. Sleep deeply. You are safe, you are at peace, and the night is here to hold you. And if you enjoyed traveling through history with me, if these quiet stories help you drift into sleep, feel free to subscribe, so you won't miss the next gentle journey we take together. Good night, and may your dreams be soft and kind. And how she still became one of the most powerful figures in European history. If you wish to continue this journey, a journey that peers deep into the shadows behind the throne, where truth often carries an unpleasant scent, then stay with us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so that each night, as the lights dim, we can meet again to wander through stories that are eerie, mesmerizing, and impossible to turn away from. Keep watching, because what comes next is far more disturbing. Shocking secret number 11. The bedchamber no one wished to enter. In the dim, breathless hours before sunrise, when the Tudor palace lay silent except for the groaning of old beams and the distant rustle of servants beginning their day, there existed one place every attendant approached with caution: the private bedchamber of Queen Elizabeth I. It was the room where the Virgin Queen slept, dreamed, aged, and performed her most intimate rituals. Yet for those who served her, it was also a space whispered about with unease, a space they entered only with steady breath and whispered prayers. Shocking secret number 11 rises from behind that heavy velvet curtain. Elizabeth's bedchamber carried a smell so dense and enduring that servants dreaded opening its door. Contemporary descriptions, written in careful, coded language, paint a picture both vivid and unsettling. One chamber servant referred to it as a domain of lingering fragrance, a phrase that tried unsuccessfully to disguise its truth. Another called it a place where scents gather, as though they possess memory. These poetic lines were diplomatic attempts to describe what others privately labeled mouille lu nien, a smell aged like time itself. The odor came not from a single source, but from a symphony of neglect woven into daily ritual. There were the linen cloths, used each morning to wipe her face and body, then folded and placed back in a chest without washing. Even when perfumed, they absorbed layers of oils, lead dust, and sweat that deepened into a sourness over weeks. There was the lead-based makeup, flaking softly onto her pillows and embroidered sheets. Each night, bits of Venetian ceruse settled into the fabric like ghostly snow white, toxic, and impossible to remove fully. Over months, the powder created a faint metallic scent that clung to every corner of the room. There were her gowns, many worn for weeks or months, then draped over chairs or screens to air out. But heavy Tudor fabrics do not purify easily. They held the smell of sweat trapped under corsets, the tang of homemade perfume mixed with ammonia, and the musk of the pomanders she tucked beneath her skirts or held between her teeth. There were her wigs, dusted with powder, yet hiding colonies of lice. When placed on stands at night, the wigs released a subtle, warm scent, 1 part lavender, 1 part human oils, and 1 part something living. In winter, when fires burned constantly, the room filled with a haze of smoke mingled with these deeper odors. In summer, heat intensified everything. The cloths, the gowns, the wigs, even the queen herself. Her bedchamber became bowl-like, holding warmth, holding scent, holding secrets. Servants described a daily ritual that bordered on dread. Each morning, the first lady in waiting approached the chamber door, lifted the latch, and opened it only a crack. Then she paused, always paused, to let the trapped air escape. Some joked darkly that it was like opening the lid of a cauldron filled with potions. Others said nothing at all, choosing silence over treason. But the reaction was always the same. A brief intake of breath, a tightening of the jaw, a moment of endurance before stepping inside. And yet, Elizabeth loved this room. To her, it was not foul. It was familiar. It was royal. It was hers. She called the scent her royal essence, a phrase repeated by attendants with a mixture of admiration and resignation. To Elizabeth, the smell symbolized her sovereignty, her rituals, her unique place in the world. It was the fragrance of her reign, unfiltered, unapologetic, unmistakable. Inside this private sanctuary, she felt no need to hide. Here, she could remove her shoes and stockings, peel away the stiff layers of her gown, and allow her body to inhabit the room without artifice. The scent became a kind of companion, a reminder of her status, her endurance, and the rituals that shaped her daily existence. But to her servants, it was something else entirely. They whispered that the room held not just odors but memories, echoes of sleepless nights, of illness hidden behind thick makeup, of sweat trapped beneath velvet, of pomanders melting slowly in the heat. They claimed the air itself felt old, as though it had lived longer than any human present. Yet every day they entered. Every day they bowed. Every day they preserved the sanctity of a chamber whose scent made them long for fresh air. And so Elizabeth's bedchamber became a paradox, both throne and prison, sanctuary and burden, perfume and poison. It was a space in which royalty and humanity collided, where power existed alongside decay, where ritual overshadowed cleanliness, and where a queen slept surrounded by the quiet evidence of her own habits. A room no servant wished to enter, and the only room the queen called home. Shocking secret number 12. She refused to change her bed sheets for long stretches of time. In the stillness of the Tudor night, when Windsor and Richmond lay under blankets of fog and the palace fires burned low, there was one place where time seemed to cling as stubbornly as dust: the bed of Queen Elizabeth I. Regal, carved from dark wood, draped in velvet and embroidered linen, it appeared magnificent from a distance, worthy of the monarch who ruled England for more than 44 years. But up close, it carried a truth far less majestic. Shocking secret number 12 reveals that Elizabeth often refused to have her bedsheets changed, allowing them to remain on her mattress for long stretches, sometimes so long that only when the fabric grew too dirty to be flipped over would the linens finally be replaced. The Queen, ever fond of familiarity, claimed that freshly washed sheets felt strange, cold, even disruptive. She preferred linens that had softened under her body, warmed by nights upon nights of sleep, embroidered not only with gold thread, but with the memory of her presence. To Elizabeth, comfort was continuity, and continuity meant keeping what was already infused with her scent, her warmth, her rituals. But these sheets bore witness to more than royal slumber. They absorbed the sweat of long days spent beneath heavy gowns, corsets, and ruffs. They held the fine dust of lead-based makeup, which fell from her face each night like pale snowfall. They collected the natural oils of her skin, the strands of red gold hair sometimes from her own head, sometimes from wigs, and yes, on more than one occasion, lice, shaken loose during restless sleep. A lady-in-waiting once wrote in her private notes, in the careful, measured tone of someone terrified of being discovered, "Her Majesty's bed is warm as the embers of a hearth, yet carries the scent of memories no person wishes to recall." She dared not describe the details, but the implication lingered like the linen's odour itself. The practice was far from unusual in the 16th century, but Elizabeth elevated it to an art of persistence. When the linens became rumpled from use, her attendants would simply turn them over, smoothing the underside and stretching it tight, as though presenting a fresh bedding. Only when both sides bore visible stains, dark patches from sweat, grey smudges from makeup, soft yellowing from time, would they approach her about replacing them, and even then, she sometimes refused. The process of changing the sheets required lifting the mattress, removing multiple layers of fabric, reassembling the bed frame's hangings, and airing the room, tasks that disturbed the Queen's carefully structured mornings. She preferred her chambers undisturbed, her routines intact, and above all, her bed familiar. Night after night, she returned to the same sheets, warmed by her body, carrying the faint metallic note of lead powder and the sweet, musky echo of pomanders that rested near her pillow. In winter, the heat from the fireplace intensified the smell. In summer, it grew heavy and humid, like the breath of the room itself. Her attendants entered with caution. They fluffed the pillows without pressing their noses too close. They smoothed the sheets without breathing too deeply. They whispered to one another that the bed seemed alive with history. And perhaps it was. A monarch's bed is more than furniture. It is the stage on which exhaustion, illness, decision-making, and solitude all unfold. Elizabeth's sheets absorbed not only physical remnants but emotional ones. The tension of diplomatic strain, the sweat of fever after surviving smallpox, the tremble of exhaustion after hours of council meetings. In them lingered the private life of a queen who controlled nations but rarely controlled the quiet decay of her own inner sanctum. And yet, she rested peacefully, wrapped not in cleanliness, but in continuity, in fabrics that had known her for months, in warmth that belonged solely to her body's memory. To her, these sheets were comforting. To her attendants, they were daunting. To history, they are another window into the strange paradox of a woman both magnificent and profoundly human. A queen whose greatest power was control, and whose greatest comfort was the familiar scent of linens that had lain untouched for far too long. Shocking secret number 13. She refused to let anyone come too close. There is a peculiar stillness that settles over the historical accounts of Queen Elizabeth I, when they shift from describing her public grandeur to her private presence, the way she carried herself, the way she moved through a room, and most intriguingly, the invisible boundary that followed her everywhere. Courtiers learned early, and learned well, that one did not approach the Queen casually, not merely because she was sovereign over England, Ireland, and the rising ambitions of an empire, but because Elizabeth herself insisted upon distance, a distance that guarded her authority, yes, but also guarded others from the intimate truth of her scent, her breath, and the slowly fermenting powders layered beneath her collar. Thus unfolds shocking secret number 13. The Queen refused to allow anyone to come too close, not physically, not intimately, not even in brief conversation. This unwritten rule became so deeply woven into courtly behavior that it soon appeared as tradition, as etiquette, as a natural extension of majesty. But those who served her daily ladies-in-waiting, physicians, tailors, ambassadors, knew better. They knew that the space surrounding Elizabeth was not simply ceremonial. It was, in quiet whispers, called the safe distance. Those who faced her directly often described the same experience. A drifting mixture of aged lead powder, warmed by candlelight and human heat, the sharp, almost bitter note of vinegar or spiced wine from her hand-washing bowls, and beneath it all, the unmistakable, the steady breath of a woman who consumed far too much sugar and had, for many years, lost the battle with her decaying teeth. Her breath, according to a French ambassador, carried a heaviness, sweet yet damaged, a diplomatic attempt to avoid stating plainly that it was difficult to endure. Elizabeth herself understood this more clearly than her attendants dared to. She felt the weight of her powders cracking on her skin. She knew how the pomanders she tucked against her tongue sometimes dissolved unevenly. She felt the sting of vinegar not as a cleansing agent, but as a mask, a veil placed between her and the world. And so she cultivated a rule: do not stand too near the Queen. She couched it in language of dignity, calling the distance a mark of royal respect. She expected courtiers to bow from afar, to speak from a measured span, to approach only as far as her gloved hand might indicate. In portraits of the era, her posture reinforces the rule. Her chin lifted, her body angled fractionally away, her fingers extended with exquisite precision, as though even the painter must remember not to follow her too closely with his gaze. But in the private writings of the court, a different truth emerges. One lady of the chamber confessed, "Her Majesty's nearness is like the heat of a brazier, felt by all, endured by few, avoided by many." Brosses, a gentleman of the presence chamber, wrote cautiously, "We stand where she instructs, for any closer brings a scent we dare not name." The scent they avoided was not a single note, but an accumulation. Lead and vinegar beneath her chin, pomander musk rising from her breath, the faint ammonia of garments perfumed with her own strange mixtures, weeks or months of fabric worn close to the skin. And yet Elizabeth moved through these realities with complete assurance. To her, distance was not avoidance, it was power. It allowed her to maintain the illusion of perfection, of control, of a monarch untouched by mortal flaws. When ambassadors approached, she extended conversations from afar, making them project their voices across the chamber. When physicians wished to examine her, she demanded they speak before stepping forward. When ladies-in-waiting dressed her, they learned to hold their breath in discreet, practiced intervals. Even during moments of supposed intimacy, leaning in to whisper to a trusted courtier, blessing a child, greeting a noblewoman, Elizabeth never fully crossed her own invisible line. She would angle her face just so, turn her body slightly aside, or speak while maintaining a careful, consistent gap. She mastered the art of appearing close without ever truly being close. Over time, this practice shaped her entire reign. Courtiers believed they were preserving her sanctity. Ambassadors believed they were honoring English custom. The public believed their queen existed on a higher plane, radiant, untouchable, divine. Only her servants knew the human truth, that the boundary around her was a fragile circle of air, a buffer of inches, designed not merely to protect her image, but to shield others from the mingled odors of lead, sweat, vinegar, pomanders, and breath worn thin by a lifetime of sugar. And yet, in this strange practice, there is something achingly human. A woman aware of her body's burdens. A monarch determined to control every perception. A queen who transformed discomfort into ritual, and ritual into power. Thus the distance remained. An invisible throne she carried with her, a space of silence, scent, and sovereignty, through which no one dared pass. Shocking secret number 14. At times, she powdered her neck, chest, and even her hands with white lead. In the long, drifting twilight of the Tudor courts, where torches flickered against stone walls, and the scent of rushes mingled with damp corridors, there was always one constant presence: the luminous, ghost-pale figure of Queen Elizabeth I. Her face, unmistakable in portraits, gleamed with the cold brightness of Venetian ceruse, the infamous white lead paste that defined Tudor beauty. But what many did not realize, or dared not record openly, was that the Queen's powdered mask did not end at her jawline. Thus emerges shocking secret number 14. Elizabeth often extended her toxic cosmetic ritual across her neck, shoulders, chest, and sometimes even her hands, creating a second skin, a pale, glimmering shell meant to maintain one illusion: perfect, seamless whiteness. The ideal of noble beauty in the 16th century demanded a complexion untouched by sun, labor, or blemish. For Elizabeth, who carried the scars of smallpox scars she had borne since the year 1562, the pressure to maintain this illusion intensified with every passing decade. Her ladies-in-waiting documented, in quiet, guarded notes, the slow expansion of her makeup ritual. They wrote of mornings when the Queen, already seated upright among velvet cushions, directed her attendants to brush ceruse downward from her chin to the hollow of her throat. They described days when she insisted that the whiteness extend to the tops of her shoulders visible, when her gown's collar dipped lower so that no hint of natural skin tone betrayed the theatrical facade she presented. The effect, under candlelight, was startling: a smooth, unbroken expanse of pale skin, gleaming like marble carved into the shape of a monarch. But the illusion came at a cost that revealed itself most clearly in the heat. For when Elizabeth perspired as every mortal does, the lead paste did not simply glisten, it melted. Witnesses wrote, in cautious metaphor, of seeing pale streams forming along the curve of her neck, of droplets gathering near the pearl-lined edges of her ruff, of soft white streaks sliding toward the collar of her gown. Others observed that the milk-colored residue left faint, ghostly handprints on anything she touched: paper, textiles, even the backs of chairs. One ambassador recorded that during a summer audience, the Queen dabbed at her throat with a linen cloth, and when she lowered it, the fabric bore a mark as pale as the moon, a polite way of admitting that the melting ceruse had stained it. For those standing near her, the experience could be overwhelming. The scent of vinegar used to soften the ceruse rose sharply when warmed by her skin. The mixture of sweat and lead created a faint metallic odor, unsettling and persistent. Courtiers, recognizing these early signs of the melt, often found sudden reasons to bow, step back, or request permission to withdraw. And yet, Elizabeth persisted. To her, the whitened skin was not vanity, but sovereignty. It signaled purity, power, and an almost divine separation from the ordinary world. She believed that a flawless exterior restored the majesty smallpox had tried to take from her. She believed that appearing unblemished strengthened her rule, especially in a world where women were scrutinized ruthlessly, harshly, endlessly. But beneath this porcelain armor, the truth endured, a truth that spoke softly each time the lead cracked, each time it bled into the embroidery of her gown, each time a nobleman stepped away with discreet haste. Elizabeth lived behind a mask that covered not just her face, but her very body. A mask she rebuilt every morning, a mask that slowly poisoned her, a mask that melted like candle wax whenever the palace grew warm. And so, in the shimmering haze of Tudor courts, the Queen's pale glow was not merely beauty, it was a fragile performance, a glittering illusion maintained stroke by stroke, layer by layer, until even her hands gleamed with that strange, ghostly light. Shocking. Secret number 15. She refused to allow physicians to examine her body. In the fading light of her later years, when Queen Elizabeth I had already reigned for more than 44 years, when England had weathered storms, wars, plague, and the ambitions of countless rivals there, remained one truth. The Virgin Queen guarded more fiercely than any border. No physician was permitted to see the body beneath her gowns and cosmetics. Thus concludes our final revelation. Shocking secret number 15. Elizabeth refused physical examination, choosing illusion over exposure, distance over diagnosis, and ultimately, myth over the mortal truth of her failing flesh. It began quietly, long before the final decade of her life. Elizabeth had always disliked physicians, not their presence, but their purpose. To examine meant to reveal. To diagnose meant to acknowledge. To touch meant to expose the vulnerable flesh behind the mask she had spent a lifetime perfecting. Even in her 40s, she treated medical intervention as an intrusion upon the image she projected to her court. Flawless, untouchable, resolute. But as age crept upon her softly at first, then with a relentless grip, the Queen's avoidance hardened into an absolute rule. By the year 1602, When her health began to decline sharply, it was widely known that no doctor had been allowed to examine her directly for many years. Instead, attendants observed her from a respectful distance, offering descriptions rather than diagnosis. She coughs. She trembles. 2a. She eats little today. She slept poorly. But no one touched her skin. No one pressed a hand to her forehead. No one lifted her chin or looked into her mouth. To do so would have required crossing the final boundary Elizabeth maintained between her royal persona and her human body. Under her ruffs and layered gowns, truths were forming truths she could not bear her physicians to see. Her skin, after decades of lead-based cosmetics, had grown fragile and fissured, cracking at the jawline, peeling at the neck, leaving raw patches she concealed beneath fresh layers of ceruse each morning. Her teeth, blackened from decades of sugar consumption, had loosened. Some had fallen out entirely. Courtiers noted that her speech grew softer, not from politeness, but from discomfort. Her breath, laden with decay, became something attendants described obliquely as troubled sweetness, a phrase hiding more than it revealed. Her body, rarely bathed, carried odors absorbed into flesh over years of ritualistic neglect. Odors no perfume, no pomander, no veil of rosewater could fully mask. These were secrets a queen could not allow the world to witness. Not her court, not her enemies, and certainly not those whose job was to observe closely, to touch, to probe, to diagnose. Therefore, she banned them. In her final months, physicians stood helplessly at a distance, while Elizabeth sat propped on cushions, still dressed in layers of velvet and lace, refusing to lie down for fear it would be taken as a sign she had surrendered to death. She insisted she was merely tired. She insisted she needed only rest. She insisted, above all, that no one should approach her with intent to examine. One physician wrote privately, "Her Majesty fears the uncovering of that which she has long concealed." Another lamented, "We are left to watch from afar, for she will not let us near." Her ladies-in-waiting, loyal to the end, obeyed her wishes. They guarded her physical privacy as fiercely as she guarded her throne. They never revealed, even after her death, the full extent of what they saw or smelled in those final weeks. But traces of truth seep through the records. Elizabeth's refusal may not have hastened her death, but it ensured she died as she lived. Wrapped in image, protected by distance, hidden behind the armor of illusion she had crafted through decades of reign. On the night of 23 March, 1603, when she finally slipped into silence, she did so, still clothed, still painted, still unexamined. A queen who once commanded armies, who defied empires, who reshaped her nation, could not bear the simple, mortal vulnerability of being seen as she truly was. She chose instead to remain a myth, to die in dignity sustained by shadows, not in truth revealed by candlelight. Thus, her final secret settles over history like a veil. A woman who conquered the world, yet feared the gaze of those meant to heal her. And now, as we gently reach the end of this long journey together, slowly opening door after door into the most hidden secrets of Queen Elizabeth I, let the story begin to close, like the final candle in a quiet room melting down to its last drop of wax. Take a slow breath and allow every sharp image, every heavy scent, every unsettling detail to drift softly into the shadows behind you. Even though these secrets were startling, sometimes shocking, sometimes chilling when we step back and look from a distance, we see that they were simply fragments of a human life. A life lived in the blinding light of power, but hidden behind countless layers of masks, powders, and silence. At its deepest level, the story stops being about hygiene or strange habits. It becomes a reminder that even the people who seem untouchable, the ones who stand at the very top of the world, carry soft, vulnerable corners they desperately try to hide. All of us have things we don't want others to see, and sometimes power doesn't make us stronger, it only makes us lonelier. Let your mind loosen now, as if we're standing at the end of a long corridor in an old palace, where every echo has faded, and only the faint sound of your footsteps remains on the cool stone floor. The layers of white lead, the heavy gowns, the old perfumes, all begin to dissolve, slowly, gently, turning into a thin mist drifting away from your thoughts. Now there is only your breathing, steadier, slower, and a quiet sense of calm spreading down your shoulders, along your arms, all the way to your fingertips. Elizabeth's story, in the end, carries a deeply human message. Do not let fear of being seen, fear of being known, turn you into a prisoner inside your own life. Truth can make us fragile, yes, but only when we accept it do we become truly free. And now, as you lie there, with your eyelids growing heavier, let the noise of the day slip away, just like the great wooden doors of the Tudor palace slowly closing in the dark. Thank you for being here, for listening, for wandering through this strange, haunting, almost poetic tale of power, fear, and solitude. I wish you a deep, peaceful sleep, soft, quiet, and gentle as the breath of night. Sleep well, and don't forget to subscribe, so that each evening we can step together into another journey, gentle, mysterious, and full of stories waiting to be whispered. See you tomorrow night.